How many of you remember seeing on TV or the news or anything 2 years ago, there was a little 7-year-old boy who was lost in the mountains in the Seligman area? Do any of you remember seeing it? They brought in the military, which has never been done in the history of the world, for a missing child. It's my son Cole who's sitting over there. And we were up at my mother's home, and she built a home 2 miles straight up the top of a mountain, about 13 miles from Seligman in the middle of nowhere. And we were visiting there right after Christmas, and it was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and we'd all sat down to play cards, and he was playing with stuffed animals, loves stuffed animals. In fact, they're here with him today. They go everywhere. He was playing on the steps with stuffed animals, and at about 9:15, it was quiet, which for him is rare. And so we all said, you know, Cole's awfully quiet. We should go see what he's up to. So we went looking, and he was nowhere to be found. We noticed the back door was open, his boots were gone, and a lightweight jacket. Well, it was wintertime, January 5th actually, and it was about, in the morning it was about 65 degrees out. It gets cold there at night in the 30s or so, but it was about 65 degrees. We went outside and started looking for him. We couldn't find him anywhere. Now, if you know Cole, my mother had a house in Surprise, seven houses away from us. He would not go from my house to her house without somebody walking with him. That's what a big chicken he was. So for him to ever go outside anywhere by himself was unheard of. So we looked and looked, we combed the property, got the neighbors looking. Finally, someone said, you need to call the police. And I thought, oh God, I don't want to get them all involved. Like, he just doesn't do this. He's going to show up any minute. But keep in mind, we're in the middle of the woods. There's wild animals and no neighbors and trees. Lots and lots of trees and mountains. So we called the police. About an hour later, they had a command center set up. Before we knew it, we had a 5-county-wide search going on. They had mapped out a perimeter 3 miles around her property. We had 500 volunteers. We had 3 teams of dogs coming and rotating. We had countless people on horses. We must have had 300 people on 4-wheelers searching for that child. We couldn't find him anywhere. At about 6 o'clock, they said it's going to get cold tonight, really cold, like we expect it to drop to about 15 degrees, and he will not survive if we don't find him. So we're bringing in the military. And they did. We already had choppers looking for him, but they brought in 2 Blackhawks and a C-130 so they could fuel the Blackhawks in the air so they would not have to go back to Nellis to refuel. I've been doing good. Usually I get through this, okay? But anyway, so they brought in the military, and can I tell you that was the most surreal thing? I remember standing in front of the windows, and she's kind of an A-frame front of the house, and it's all windows, and we were standing there, and the C-130 comes across the front of the house, and the whole house shakes, and we're just waiting for Schwarzenegger to come propelling down. It was just crazy. And then they brought in the FBI. We had 8 FBI agents there. They flew in the world's foremost expert on missing children from Virginia. It was to the point where the FBI agents were pulling us aside going, who do you people know? Like, are you related to Obama? We said, we don't know anybody. And my mom's like, we know Jesus, we're praying. And I'm like, we don't know Jesus. Well, I mean, not personally, but I mean, we're praying, but we don't know anybody. We have no idea why you're all here. But what had happened was my sister-in-law had put it on Facebook. And I was texting everybody updates, family and friends. There was about, 65 people on a group text. And I was sending them messages every half hour on what was happening, and it was going viral. They were posting my texts on Facebook. We found out those texts went all around the world. We had whole churches of every denomination praying for that child. I had one missing children's site alone contact me afterwards and tell me that he had counted over 100,000 people that prayed for him just on his missing children's site. And so it went everywhere. It was all over TV, all over the newspaper, and still they couldn't find him. And they told us that they were bringing in the planes because they had an infrared FLIRs, if I'm saying this right, and they could detect heat, and that's how they would find him. They'd searched every house within 4 miles. In fact, they tortured my mother's poor neighbors. They just were convinced somebody had him. They went through their homes 4 times. They did an amazing job. I've never seen a team of people search so hard for a child. It got so cold that night, it got down to 15 degrees, and it was windy. And we were riding around on four-wheelers, and I can remember I had a parka and a hat and mittens. I was wrapped in blankets, and I was cold. And I remember thinking, there's this, other than an act of God, this is just not happening. We kept sending out updates to everybody, and nobody could find him. The next morning, we started planning the funeral. They came in and said, there's only two things that could have happened at this point. One, he was kidnapped, which we can't believe is possible because you're up a mountain in the middle of nowhere. Who would have got him? The second thing is that he was eaten by wild animals. So we found a cave. It happens to be one straight down a mile from your mom's cabin, and we expect to find remains there. So at about 11 a.m. that morning, they were going to search the cave for remains, and we started planning the funeral. At about 11:30, there was a knock at the door, and my husband opened the door, and Cole was standing there in complete, perfect condition. With the FBI agents and the pilot and the couple that found them. You're going to love this. They're from the town of Seligman, and their name is Bill and Janet Pope. So the Popes found him. And they found him they told us all that children will take the path of least resistance, and they'll go towards water. So they sent all the dogs and horses and everybody downhill. He went up, nowhere near water. And they found him on somebody's camper, which was their hunting lodge, so to speak. And they said that they drove in the yard. And, well, first of all, they said they had driven by there the day before. And she said to her husband, I just have this feeling we should go by this area again. And he's like, no, we did that already. We're not going back there. We were searching there last night. And she said, just go. Something's telling me to go. So they did. And as they drove by there, he was sitting on the porch. And they stopped. And he ran up to him. And they had a bottle of water. And she had a thing of mints. And he downed the mints and downed the water. And they called the FBI, and the FBI said, don't move him, we're coming to get him, because they figured he'd be in terrible state, and they were ready to airlift him to a hospital. Anyway, they got there, and they were like, he's perfect. Other than a little bit of chapped lips, there's nothing wrong with him. And so they brought him back to the house, and of course, we were all in tears, and the agent said to me, I need to interview him because we're pretty sure he was kidnapped, and due to all the press, they had to have brought him back because he couldn't have survived this. So they brought him in, and they sat him down. They gave him a tube of Pringles, his favorite thing. So he's inhaling Pringles, drinking water, and the FBI agent says, Cole, can you tell us what happened yesterday? And he said, yeah, I went outside, and I started walking, and there was a house that's over there, and Dad said we couldn't just go see that house because we'd have to go down the mountain and up, and we'd get lost. And I was outside and thought, I guess I'll go see that house. So I thought if I just walk down the road a little and then cut across and go up, I can probably get there. So I did that, and I got lost. And I walked all day for a long, long time, and then I got scared, and then I started to cry and thought, what if everybody goes home without me? And then it started to get really cold, super, super cold. And he said, I found a rock, and in this area there's rocks this big. And he said, I climbed up on the rock, and he spent 10 minutes telling us how cold that rock was and how cold it was outside and how he was trying to get his arms inside his jacket to stay warm. And he said, I stayed on the rock all night. And then in the morning I walked, and in the middle of the forest by a tree there was a faucet. And he said, I turned the handle on the faucet and water came out the hose, and he said it was the most amazing water you've ever tasted. And he said, water that we have here and at home is disgusting. And this was the best water ever. So of course the agents have the maps out, and they're trying to figure out where there's water, and there's no water anywhere. So they were like, are you sure you weren't by a house? No, he never saw a house. And they said, just a plain old faucet and by a tree in the middle of nowhere. Yep. He said, okay. And then he said, I kept walking, and I found this camper, and I went up to the door, and nobody was home, so I just thought I'd lay down on the steps, and in they drove. So the agent said, well, Cole, what did you do all night? And he said, well, I sang with the birdies. They kept me company. And he said, you with the birdies? And he said, yep, I was with the birdies all night. In fact, we prayed together. And so my mom has a big wraparound deck with all these bird feeders on it. And I said to him, Cole, you mean these kind of birdies? You were with these birdies singing all night? And he started to laugh at us, and he said, no, Mom, these are not those kind of birdies. They're not birdies you've ever seen before. So the agent patted me on the back and said, congratulations, you have nothing more than a miracle. We're out of here. And they started to leave. And I'm still in a state of shock. So I said, where are you going? And he's like, well, there were birdies. And I'm like, he's 7. what do birdies have to do with anything? And he said, well, you don't know? I said, no, what? And he said, well, read about it. It's been published and printed. Any time we go look for missing children who have been gone for an extended amount of time that should not have survived, they tell us the next day. Birdies kept him company all night. So he said, you and I both know who the birdies are. You have nothing short of a miracle. And they packed up. We went outside and said goodbye to everybody. And they left. And it was a little tough to take because I struggled with birdies and why did God save my son? Furthermore, why did he go outside? Well, about a month later, my friend Vanessa, who's here, was having a birthday, and I had made a plaque of a picture of Cole walking through the woods that somebody snapped with the FBI agents, and somebody imposed a picture of Jesus up in the corner. So it looks like Jesus looking down on them as they're walking up to the house through the woods. And I framed it for her with a thank you because she had St. Clair's praying and everybody praying, and she opened it up and she was looking at it, and Cole came up to her and he said, Vanessa, do you want to go, that's Jesus, do you want to go to heaven and see him someday? And she said, well, yes, of course, not today, but I want to go someday. Do you want to go and see him too? And he said, no, I've already met him. And she said, what? He said, well, he was with me that night I was lost on the rock all night. Well, of course, this is a house full of people, and the entire party went whoosh, and he went, and ran out the back door, and we all ran after him. And we were like, what happened? We want to hear about it. And he's like, no, I'm not talking about this. And I said, why? He goes, well, this is weird. Nobody else talks to Jesus but me, and I don't want to talk about it. So Vanessa's like, okay, we'll all go inside. You go outside and see what you can get out of him. So they all went back inside, and I went outside, and I said, Cole, what happened that night? You need to tell me. He's like, no, I don't want to talk about this. And I said, well, I need to hear this. And I said, why don't you want to talk about it? And he's like, because nobody else talks to Jesus. Nobody else sees Jesus but me. And it's kind of weird, so I want to talk about it. And I said, well, it's important we talk about it, and I need to know what happened, so you need to tell me. And he's like, okay. And so I'm going to sum this up for you, because it took months to get the entire story out of him, because he didn't like talking about it. But here's what happened. He said he got to the rock, and when he climbed up on the rock, he was freezing, trying to get his arms in his coat, and he said a big angel appeared to him. And he said it was the biggest, whitest, brightest angel I've ever seen, and it was beautiful, Mom. And he said, and it said to me, Cole, you're going to die tonight, but it's okay, you're going to go to heaven. And he said, Mom, did you know that there are bad angels and there are good angels? And I guess I hadn't really thought about it, but I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, this wasn't a good angel. It was pretending to be one. And he said, the minute the angel said that, poof, Jesus appeared right next to me. And he said, when Jesus showed up, that angel turned from a big, white, bright, pretty angel to a man. And he was the boss of the bad guys. So at this point, I'm like, what? He was what? And he said, he was the boss of the bad guys. And I said, what bad guys? And he said, well, did you know down there, way down there in the earth, there's a lot of really bad guys, and this is the boss of all the bad guys. And I said, who told you this? And he said, Jesus did. I said, Jesus told you that guy was the boss of all the bad guys? And he said, yeah, and you don't want to go there. There's a lot of bad guys there, and he's the boss of all the bad guys. I said, well, what did he look like? And he said, an old man in a dark black suit. But he said he had a sword, and it was the coolest sword I've ever seen. Now, Cole was into Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers and stuff, and he said, it's a sword like I've never seen. It was a big, round, curved sword, and he held it in his hand, and he said he yelled at Jesus, and he told him to get out of there. This is his battle. And he said, then Jesus got mad, Mom, and Jesus yelled back at him and told him to leave and to leave now. And he said, then the boss, the bad guys, yelled back and said he wasn't going anywhere. This was his battle. And he said, then, Mom, 4 angels showed up, and then 10 angels showed up, and then 11 angels showed up, and they all chased after the boss, the bad guy, and then poof, he was gone, and poof, they were gone. It was just me and Jesus. I said, okay. So this was a little difficult to take, because it's so out of anything I'm used to. Anyway, he said that he spent the night with Jesus. They prayed. I believe now they prayed in tongues. He tried to explain it to us as making animal sounds and weird noises and languages he couldn't understand. And that he told us all night there was a duck with him, a big duck. And I said, Jesus brought a duck? And he said, yep, big duck. So I got out my computer and I pulled up pictures of white ducks. And I said, is this it? He'd laugh. No, that's not it. I go, well, that's a duck. He said, well, he was flying in the air. He's a big duck. So I pulled up pictures of white flying ducks. And he'd go, no, he'd laugh. Those aren't it. Those aren't it. So then I pulled up a picture of a big flying white dove. And I showed it to him. And I said, is this your duck? And he goes, that's it. That's the duck that was with us all night. I said, well, that's not a duck, that's a dove. And I said, my guess is that's the Holy Spirit. So then he said that it was just him and Jesus all night. And then in the morning, he said that he met Jesus' mom and dad. And I said, so you got to meet God? And he said, no. And I said, well, God's his dad. And he said, I know, but he has two dads, Mom. He has like a stepdad, right? And he's looking confused, like, I don't know what I'm talking about. And I said, well, yeah, you mean Joseph? And he's like, yeah, that's him. I met Mary and Joseph. They came in the morning and they asked me if I was being a good boy, and I said yes. And they said that they just came to meet me, and they talked to Jesus for a little while and told me to be good, and then they left. And he said, then an angel came, and this is God's biggest, most powerful angel, but he couldn't remember his name. And he said he came and he led us. And he went with me and Jesus, and we walked, and we found the water, and we had the water, and then we walked to the house, and then the big angel left, and it was just me and Jesus told me to lay down on the steps, and someone would be there to get me soon. And he said, after he said that, somebody drove in the yard. And I said, well, did Jesus leave? And he said, no, Mom, I could see him up in the trees. In fact, I saw him follow us all the way in the truck. I kept looking up. And when we got out of the truck and I started walking with the agents through the trees, I looked up and there he was. So that picture that we had was actually a real event. And he said, when I got up to the house and we were about to turn the corner to go to the door, I looked back and he was gone. And then he went in the house. Well, Cole has had several visits from Jesus since then. He's also had visits from a lot of evil. We've struggled with a variety of things. It started about 6 months after he was missing. And we noticed that something was bothering him. And he came to me one day and said, Jesus says, you need to pray for me, that there's evil that haunts me. And so I said, well, did Jesus say what we need to pray? And he said, no. And that's kind of when we started our charismatic journey. And we started praying a lot and doing everything that we could. And since then, we have removed the evil. His last visit from Jesus was on Christmas Day in Seligman at the Catholic Church. We've had other events at a Catholic church in California where he saw him he was in the Mass right after the Our Father, and many people in the row got filled with the Holy Spirit, and he saw him. So it's been a blessing. We don't know really what, other than him being saved, what the purpose is or what the calling is, but we're here and we're trying. So thank you.